Hey y'all, this is our third lecture on the Civil War. So I'm going to start with Lincoln's first inaugural address. Anytime you see the word inaugural, this is their first speech that they give when they are, made into presidents, right? So I guess to put this into context, right, the South is already, a couple of states have already seceded. And as Lincoln is taking office in 1861, most of the Confederacy already seceded. And what he's going to say is that, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of the Civil War. The government will not attack you. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it, right? This is what he says in his inaugural address. He is saying that his, job as president is to preserve and protect the Union. And really, Lincoln never really acknowledges the South as a legitimate country. He sees it as a states in rebellion, and he does not say that it is even like a real thing. So he sees his job is to protect the Union, and the South has already seceded. So in 1861, he wants to preserve the Union, but in South Carolina is going to attack Fort Sumter, which we sort of looked at before. Lincoln is going to call for 75,000 troops to end this rebellion, and this is the beginning of the Civil War. And so what happens with Fort Sumter is, as the South left the Union, there were Union troops left in the Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and so Lincoln had a question of, should I, fire first? Should I try to send in supplies to Fort Sumter? Or should I just retreat? And what he decides to do is to try to resupply Fort Sumter. And when he tries to resupply South Carolina, the Confederacy attacks first, and then Lincoln calls for troops. And when Lincoln calls for troops from the states, states have to decide, are we going to leave the Union, or are we going to join the Confederacy? So essentially, here we have Washington, D.C., which is precariously close to the southern states. So South Carolina was the first one to go, but these deep south states leave before Lincoln is inaugurated president. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then these states, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, they are going to leave after Fort Sumter. They are not going to choose to send troops to go against their southern brothers. And so we finally get the 11 Confederate states down here. This is also known as the CSA, or the Confederate States of America. They are going to have to form their own, government. They have to create their constitution. And what they're essentially going to do is copy a lot of what the Union looks like, or the United States of America. But they are going to change a couple of things. Like, for example, they protect slavery in their constitution, and they use the word God. So anyway, there are some differences, but they essentially try to copy the Union. The rest of the country is in the Union, what we know as the North, but does include the West. And I think most significantly, we have what are called the border states: Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware. All of these states have slavery, right? Slavery exists in these states. Kansas is sort of still up in arms, like, is it slave or is it free? But slavery exists in what is called these border states. And if Lincoln lost, especially Maryland, then DC would have been completely surrounded. And so one of the things in the early part of the war that Lincoln has to try to do is try to fight a war against the South without making it about slavery, and to try to keep these border states from leaving the Union. So Lincoln, in the preservation of the Union, he says, if I could save the Union without freeing any slaves, I would do it. If I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So that being said, as the war starts to progress, in Fort Monroe, there is actually a question that generals have about what do we do with slaves that run to the Union lines as runaways, right? Or as they are like going into the South and fighting this war. And one of the generals is going to take slaves as contraband. And this is called the Confiscation Act of 1861. And so as they are leaving, they're not trying to free the slaves, but what they say is since these slave owners did an illegal act and they are using these slaves illegally, that gives us the right to take these slaves and use them for the war effort, I guess. So it authorized the Union seizure of rebel property for all slaves who fought with or worked for the Confederate military services, right? So technically we are still under the Constitution, and technically under the Fugitive Slave Act we are supposed to return these slaves. But this is how they're going to get around that. Just like I can't steal your cell phone if you are walking in the middle of the street, but I could take it and confiscate it, or if it's contraband in school. So this is the Confiscation Act of 1861. And at first Lincoln actually opposes even this because he's afraid that it's going to drive away the border states. When we are looking at this war, slavery is something that is, not really going to be a plus for the South because it is a security risk, because it basically takes an army to ensure the security of a slave state. The Union has almost all of the advantages. 71% of the population is in the North, or the Union. 71% of railroads are in the North. Manufacturing, 86% of manufacturing is in the Union, and industrial workers, 92%. Even if we take a look at farm acreage, the North, or the value of farmland in agriculture, while there is a lot of farmland in the South, yes, there is farmland, but is it producing food? No, it's not producing food. It's producing cotton, right? These guys actually have the food. The South only has cotton. Double the population, more of the railroads, more manufacturing, value of manufacture. And I think the other thing is like banks, money, all of this advantage is in the North. So it is a really kind of an amazing thing when you take a look at these advantages that the South held on for as long as it did. But it comes down to something that we'll talk about in a minute. I think when we look at the advantages of the North, you really have to look at this economic advantages and also the political advantages. The South left because they believe in states' rights. They don't believe in like a lot of federal power. They believe in slavery, and they do not believe in things like tariffs or a strong federal government. And when they leave, this is what they're basing their whole Confederacy on. Now, they have to create a president, and he has to run his own country in the Confederacy during war with people who don't want to pay taxes, who don't want to give handover power to a federal government. Meanwhile, Lincoln in the North is able to essentially do everything they wanted to do while the South is gone. They are going to do a lot of infrastructure. They are going to have economic reforms. They are going to print money. They are going to sell bonds. They are going to strengthen the banks with the National Banking Act. They're going to do a Homestead Act to try to get Western settlements. They are going to start a transcontinental railroad. They are going to do all of these things while the South is gone, and it's going to improve their economy. Meanwhile, in the Confederacy, they have huge problems of inflation. They have problems raising money. And they are having a hard time even getting tax money from a lot of these people. So one of the biggest advantages is this economic advantage of the North. So if we take a look at these advantages, economic, population, all of these things, how is it the South lasted so long? And I'd like to give this analogy of the time I tried to play a game of Tic Tac Toe against a chicken. For a short amount of time when I was going to graduate school, I lived in Las Vegas. And I was very poor. I was in graduate school, and there was an ad that came on, and it said, go to the Tropicana Hotel, play a game of tic-tac-toe against a chicken, and if you win, you get $1 million. Now, I lived in Vegas for a long time. I was never compelled to get up out of my seat, and this ad did it for me. So I got up, I went to the Tropicana, I walked in the door, and here at the door was a chicken in a box. And, essentially, The chicken is in the box, and the chicken is like, okay, right? And so the game is, if I win, I get $1 million. And so the chicken's going to go, and he's going to be like, "Merk," right? And he's going to go here. Then I'm like, "Merk," right? And then the chicken's like, "Merk," right? And then I'm like here, and then the chicken, whatever. Now, when we keep going on, right, how is the game going to end? It does not end in either winning, right? The person who has to win was me, right? I had to win to get $1 million. Now, I played to a draw. The chicken did not win. I played to a draw, so what I got was like a deck of cards. The chicken is not playing to win. The chicken is playing not to lose. And this is a huge advantage. If you are playing a defensive war, if you are just playing to not lose, it is easier for you. You are playing a defensive war. So in this war, who has to win is a major question. And who has to win is the North. The North has to compel the South to get back into the Union. This is not an easy task, right? It is not easy to win a game of Tic Tac Toe if the other player is going to just play to not lose, right? The only way you really win is if the other player, makes a mistake. So this chicken played, hundreds of games of Tic Tac Toe in a day, and he never lost, right? He was almost always a draw because he was playing defensively. What is my point? The chicken wasn't even really playing to not lose. The chicken was playing for some food that showed up anyway. My point is the South didn't have to win. The South had to just not lose. They were the chicken in this case. They had to just play to not lose. If they continued existing, they continued winning. Lincoln had to wage a total war. Lincoln had to compel the South to get back into the Union. I am going to make your life so terrible that you wish you were back in the Union. This is the tactic he chooses. And so with this total war tactic, Lincoln decides that this is how he's going to get the Union back together, and it is a lot. The South did not have a whole lot, but what they had was cotton, and what they were basically counting on was that in this King Cotton diplomacy. In order for the CSA to win, they needed to get Great Britain to side with them, and they thought that Great Britain would side with them because they needed their cotton, and the South believed that they were turned to them. What they don't realize is that England is just going to turn to India for their cotton because they do not want to get involved in this squabble. So Britain officially stays neutral. It never recognizes the Confederacy. Slavery had been outlawed for a long time in England, I think back to the 1830s. Southerners, they did allow Southern ships to dock in their ports. So if a Southern ship made it to England, they would trade with them. But in reality, what's going to happen is Great Britain is going to turn to India, and Britain is going to basically benefit from the war. They hold a lot of the bonds, they're exporting guns, and all of this. So I guess in the last year, Lee's army survived on British bacon. We'll see. Anyway, and the Union's policy, while the South is trying to trade with Great Britain, the Union's policy is to blockade, to suffocate the South through a blockade. They are not going to be able to trade that cotton for anything. They are going to starve them out. They're going to cut off the Confederacy. They're going to control the Mississippi, and they are going to stop all trade with a blockade. The Union's advantage is also the Navy, whereas the South does not have a strong Navy. And so this blockade is going to be successful, which is one of the reasons why New Orleans is one of the first places to fall to the Union. Because if you control New Orleans, you control so much of the trade in the Confederacy. So the Union is going to control New Orleans from 1862. There's famous stories of the French Quarter, of, being, Union troops being subjugated to repeated insults from women in return. Anyway, there's also ideas of people would pour, what are they called, chamber pots on Union soldiers' heads. While these Union soldiers are in New Orleans, they are not. They are spit on. They are, poured, feces all over. All of these things. So, not good for the troops in New Orleans with General Butler. From 1861 to 1862, the South is winning a lot of these early battles. They were trying to get this foreign help, either Great Britain or France. They are not successful in that. But as they are winning these battles, it seems like maybe Great Britain will, side with them. The war is actually really unpopular in the North. If you imagine like hundreds of thousands of people dying in this war, through all of these battles. And in this early part of the war, Lincoln is really not winning anything, and the dead are piling up. The North also struggles with what's called Southern sympathizers. The goals of the war were not strong in the North. A lot of people disagreed with it. And so you have a lot of people, especially in places like Maryland, right where Washington, D.C. is, who support the Southern cause, or what they call Southern sympathizers. So you had people who were, destroying railroads, people who were spies, people who were, doing all of these things. And so Lincoln has to try to figure out what he's going to do with this. And what he does is he suspends the writ of habeas corpus. And in the Constitution, it says the privilege or writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless when in cases of rebellion or invasion and public safety may require it. So Lincoln reads this and he says, I have the right to suspend it. And what that does is it allows him to essentially jail anyone who is suspicious. Habeas corpus is the allowed to know why you are being arrested. So if you're arrested, you have to know the charge. Why am I being arrested? Now, you have to be charged with a crime. And Lincoln would just, if you suspend the writ of habeas corpus, you could just arrest people because you think they might cause a crime or these other things. And so when he suspends habeas corpus, it allows him to arrest a lot of people. And he does arrest a lot of people. One of the people he's going to arrest is going to be Merryman, who he destroyed telegraph lines. And he argues that he had this power under the War Powers part of the Constitution. Merryman is going to take this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to basically say that this is not okay, that you cannot just arrest people even during this time of war, and that it's actually Congress who should have the ability to suspend habeas corpus, not the president. And so they do declare this unconstitutional. So, there are a lot of things that Lincoln does. And he also, arrests a lot of Democratic newspaper people who are critical of the war. This is what he's doing during this time. So the North is really struggling with what is the cause of the war. They are struggling with losing the war. They are struggling with trying to, compel the South to get back into the Union. They are struggling with a lot of spies and Southern sympathizers. And they are deeply afraid that Great Britain is going to join on the side of the South. And so one of the turning points is Antietam. This is a brutal, bloody war. And the North was hoping Robert E. Lee had a victory. And he was hoping to invade the North. Lincoln is going to get this guy, General McClellan, who actually finds Lee's plans. And they are going to stop the Confederacy at Antietam Creek. And this is a huge, bloodiest day of the Civil War. And if you look at the number of dead, you would not say this was a Union win. There are 12,000 Union deaths and 10,000 Confederate deaths. But if you look at the amount of people, remember, the North has twice as many people as the Confederacy. This is a much bigger hit for the Confederacy. This is a huge amount of people in their army. And so, although the number of Union dead are huge, it is, not as big of a hit as it was to the Confederacy. And so Antietam is considered a Union win. And McClellan actually pushes back the Confederacy and they retreat. McClellan does not actually chase the Confederates, and he actually gets in trouble and fired because essentially McClellan stops and licks his wounds. He's like, 12,000 people died. I need to kind of hold off, chasing down the Confederates. But Lincoln honestly felt like if McClellan had chased them, he would have, the war would have been over then. He lets him go, he loses Lee, and the war continues. Lincoln is going to fire McClellan, and he famously says something like, if I could only find a general who would fight, I could have won this war. But Lincoln takes this opportunity of Antietam to do the Emancipation Proclamation. There are a million reasons why people think he did the Emancipation Proclamation. It is a change in his policy from before, when he says he was only doing this war to, keep the Union. Now, in the Emancipation Proclamation, he says the slaves will be free in the seceding states. So, as of January 1863, any state that was still in rebellion he would free the slaves in states where they were in rebellion. This is significant because the Emancipation Proclamation does not really free any slaves. It doesn't free slaves in the places that actually acknowledge his authority. And so what it basically says is, in any of these states that have seceded, who are actively in rebellion, I'm going to free the slaves there. What it does is it gives the moral purpose, but it does not really free any slaves. It also gives it a diplomatic purpose, because some people believe that he did this to prevent Great Britain from coming into the war. The Southern view of emancipation is that this was like a pact with the devil, that this is what he wanted all along, this is what we knew was going to happen, and that it was a violation of all of, the things that he said he was going to do. But the other thing about the Emancipation Proclamation is Frederick Douglass is one of the people who convinces Lincoln to do this. We're going to take a look at an article on this. And it allows black troops to serve in the war. Whereas before we just had the Confiscation Acts, now with the Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass is going to help to raise up black men to volunteer for the army. And he really sees this as a necessary step to citizenship, because you have to kind of fight for your freedom in order to kind of, get those freedoms after the war. So eventually, in the Union Army, blacks are going to account for about 10% of the Union Army. Lincoln admits that he probably would have never been able to win the war without black troops. And up until 1864, Southerners refused to recognize black soldiers as prisoners of war and often executed them as runaways. And famously at Fort Pillow, they are going to massacre folks there. And black units swore to remember Fort Pillow. So, black troops sign up knowing that, if they get caught behind enemy lines, they are going to be executed. So this is a serious thing. Probably one of the most famous regiments is the 54th Regiment of Massachusetts, who this is going to be, the movie Glory shows this. It's kind of an older movie at this point. So the Emancipation Proclamation, the advantage of it is that it allows for black troops. The disadvantage is it further divides a lot of people. And one of the people that do not like the Emancipation Proclamation are some of the Irish Americans who are recent immigrants to the United States. So these working class folks do not, many of these Irish immigrants are the ones who are being enlisted in the war. These are the ones who are being brought into the war. There is a conscription act, or basically a draft, that allows rich people to substitute themselves. So if I was rich, I could pay $300 and I wouldn't have to go to war. But if you're poor, you are forced into or drafted into the army. On top of the Conscription Act, you're going to have the Emancipation Proclamation, which many of these immigrants ideologically were against. Some of it was economic, because they believe that these people, if they're freed, are going to kind of come up and take their jobs. So in 1863 in New York City, Irish immigrants are going to have the New York City draft riots, where they are rioting against the Republicans who are trying to sign over the conscription or the draft and the Emancipation Proclamation. They're going to burn down an orphanage for black folks. They are going to lynch black people in the streets. They are going to also attack a lot of prominent rich Republicans. And this, if there wasn't a civil war, this would be one of the biggest uprisings in American history. It's the New York City draft riots. And so often people kind of show, Irish folks as being, monstrous. We're going to take a closer look at this again. But the New York City draft riots happened in 1863. Gettysburg is happening around the same time in 1863. And this is, a loss for the South. and it is a Union victory. So one of the things about the Battle of Gettysburg is that Lee actually decides to, instead of just playing defensively, Lee decides to go to the north into Pennsylvania to try to have a victory. And some of this is political because in 1863, Lincoln is running for re-election. And who he's running against is what's called the Copperhead, and he's actually running against George McClellan. George McClellan is actually running as a peace Democrat, and what he's saying is we should negotiate. Abraham Lincoln has dragged us into this war. He's done things that, Lincoln is a worse tyrant and more inhumane butcher than Nero. And essentially, people who are running against Lincoln are kind of pointing out all of his problems. And McClellan is saying, let us have peace in 1864 in this election. And so in 1863, some people believe that Lee was trying to break the will of the North and, throw support behind McClellan. But in this election in 1864, in these Copperheads, essentially they're campaigning in 1863, is, people see it as, treasonous to the Union. But in the election of 1864, Lincoln is going to win, and one of the reasons why he wins is because the war takes a turn for the better for the North. And one of the things that happens is that Sherman is going to have his march to the sea, and he captures Atlanta in 1864 in September. So you have McClellan, who is essentially saying we should negotiate peace with the South, but at the same time, it looks like we are about to win the war because we capture Atlanta. Lee is going to surrender in 1865 after Lincoln wins re-election, and if we finally win the war in 1865. Lincoln is really excited. He wants to go kind of relax. He looks at his wife. He's like, let's go see a comedy. They go to the theater, and at the theater, you're going to have John Wilkes Booth, who is going to kill the president, and Andrew Johnson is going to become president. So the assassination of Lincoln in 1865, John Wilkes Booth is another example of a Southern sympathizer who, assassins Lincoln, says sic temper tyrannis, such it is with tyrants, runs off and all of that. Lincoln's funeral, that should be, that is the wrong date. It's not 1965, and 1865 is a big deal. But the Confederates have to try to think about, do we surrender? So Lee surrendered, but the Confederacy still sort of exists for a short amount of time afterwards. And there was talk about Jefferson Davis, kind of continuing the war after the surrender of Lee. Because surrender of Lee is just the surrender of army. It's not the official surrender of the Confederacy. So some people say, and this was kind of a northern, they try to kind of paint Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, as, a woman, as running away in a dress and a disguise. There was talk where maybe he would go into hiding and fight a guerrilla war for a while, but in the end he doesn't do it. And there's a big question of what are we going to do with, Jefferson Davis, and, how do we try to make him so he's not a martyr? And people start to paint him as if he tried to run away in a woman's dress. This is a early, what do you call it, Photoshop. It's not really Photoshop, but they do something else with it. But people are trying to, discredit the whole Confederacy with these actions, and soon the Confederacy will, sign over anyway. That's about it. So the impact of the war: 4 million slaves are freed, 600,000 folks are dead. The United States stays together. And before the Civil War, we say these United States, and after we're going to say the United States. And this is a major thing. It's one nation. And the federal government establishes its supremacy over the states, and it sparks industrialization in the North. I don't know. If you guys want to take a look at this war, you could. But I think I'm going to stop it there. All right, guys, take care, and I will talk to you later.